The most dangerous mistake anyone can make is thinking a quiet man doesn't notice everything. I let her make that mistake for 2 years. My name is Walter Combs, and on a Tuesday morning in late October, my wife looked up from her tablet and told me our marriage needed, in her words, some financial clarity. I was at the counter in our kitchen in a suburb outside Charlotte, North Carolina, pouring coffee into the same chipped mug I'd used for 11 years. Denise was already in her blazer, the navy one she wore for board calls, her hair pulled back the way it always was. On mornings, she had to look like the person running a $140 million regional hospital network. She set a folder on the counter next to my mug, careful not to let it touch the coffee ring. My attorney drew this up, she said, not looking at me, scrolling through something on her tablet. It protects what's mine going into this next phase of my career. I looked at the folder, her firm's letterhead in the corner, the kind of crisp, weighty paper that costs more than it should. We've been married 4 years, Denise, I said. Which is exactly why we need to formalize things now, she said. The hospital board is talking about elevating me to system president. There'll be a lot more scrutiny, a lot more at stake. She finally looked at me, and there was that smile, the one that had charmed a boardroom of investors and apparently still worked on me most mornings, except this one. Take your time with it. Marcus is available if you have questions. She grabbed her bag and left without kissing me goodbye. She hadn't done that in 5 months. I'd counted, the way I count most things, quietly, without telling anyone. The door clicked shut behind her, and I sat there with the folder for a long time before I opened it. 14 pages. Her signature already on page 11. On page 7, my assets were described as modest and largely unverified. I read that phrase 3 times, not anger. Something colder and more useful than anger. Hey folks, before we get into this one, if you're new here, welcome. I tell true stories, mine and the ones men have trusted me with over the years. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from tonight. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't, and settle in, because this one's got some turns in it. But this story doesn't start on that Tuesday in October. It starts almost 6 years earlier, on a rainy Thursday night in a hotel ballroom in Atlanta, when Denise Rourke walked up to me holding 2 glasses of wine like she'd already decided one of them was mine. I was 61 years old at the time, recently retired, standing near the exit at a fundraising gala my late business partner's widow had dragged me to. I don't do well at those things. Too many people asking what I do for a living, like retirement, isn't an acceptable answer. I was nursing a club soda and counting the minutes until I could decently leave. You look like a man who'd rather be anywhere else, she said, handing me a glass I hadn't asked for. That obvious? Only to someone who feels the same way. She had a laugh that came easy, the kind that makes you feel like you said something clever even when you didn't. Denise Rourke. I run cardiac services for Piedmont Regional. What do you do? Here's the question I always dreaded. I'd learned over the years to keep the answer small. I'm retired. Used to be in industrial equipment. Boring stuff. Most people's eyes glaze over right about there. Hers didn't. She asked a follow-up question. Then another. We talked for almost 2 hours that night, about her climb through hospital administration, her plans, her ambitions, the way she talked about the board like it was a chessboard she intended to own one day. I liked that about her. I still do, honestly, even now. Ambition isn't a flaw. It's what she did with it that I have a problem with. Here's what Denise thought she knew about me that night. A comfortable retiree, modest condo, drove a Buick, a man who'd spent 30 years managing warehouses and supply routes for other people's companies. Here's what was actually true. 11 years before that gala, I had sold my share of a manufacturing logistics company. I co-founded the one my business partner's widow still ran a piece of to a firm out of Charlotte for a number that still makes my accountant go quiet on the phone. No press release. No announcement. I signed the papers on a Friday, drove home, grilled a steak, and watched a ball game. That was the whole celebration. I've never believed in making noise about money. Noise attracts people who want a piece of it, and I'd watched that happen to men I respected. The quietest man in the room usually has the most to lose by talking, and the most sense not to. We dated for a year and a half. She introduced me to her hospital colleagues as her low-key partner, the retired guy, harmless and steady. I never corrected her. I wore the part comfortably flannel in the fall, a 15-year-old truck, a watch I'd had since my 40s. My late partner's widow, Carol, pulled me aside at a dinner about 2 months before the wedding. She talks about the hospital budget with more feeling than she talks about you, Carol said, half joking, mostly not. She's ambitious, Carol. That's not a crime. I didn't say it was. She looked at me a long moment. I just want somebody to see you the way I do. We got married on a Saturday in June at a small vineyard outside Asheville. Her idea intimate, she called it. 30 guests. Efficient, I thought, though I didn't say it. Her hospital board sent an enormous arrangement of white orchids that must have cost more than our catering. I remember thinking that was an unusual amount of enthusiasm from a board of directors for their vice president's wedding. I filed that thought away, the way I file most things. The first year was good. I want to say that plainly, because it matters later it was good. Then, about a year and 8 months in, on a Sunday evening in March, Denise was at the hospital, handling a board matter, as she put it. I was home, going through our shared cloud drive, looking for the renewal paperwork on our homeowner's policy. I took a wrong turn into a folder labeled Contingency, and there it was. A document titled Transition Framework W. I opened it. Read it twice. Sat very still for longer than I usually do, which for me is saying something. 9 pages. Clinical. Thorough. Our marriage broken into phases, like a hospital expansion plan. Phase 1, consolidate shared accounts. Phase 2, increase her personal asset visibility ahead of the system president promotion. Phase 4, initiate separation, minimize reputational exposure. And on page 6, a name. Dr. Aaron Voss, Chief Financial Officer for the hospital system, a man who'd shaken my hand at 3 fundraisers and always called me Chief, like it was a nickname we shared instead of something faintly mocking. I closed the laptop, went to the kitchen, made a pot roast, low and slow, the way my mother taught me, because some nights call for the kind of task that keeps your hands busy while your mind works something out. Opened a decent bottle of red, set 2 places. Sitting there in that quiet kitchen, something became clear to me that was almost worse than the betrayal itself. She hadn't married me despite my being unremarkable. She'd married me because of it. No public profile, no headlines about the sale of my company. A steady, boring older husband who made an ambitious woman look grounded, made a hospital board comfortable, made whatever questions they had about her personal judgment quietly disappear. I wasn't a husband. I was a credential. And the most dangerous part, she was right about everything she thought she knew. I was quiet. I kept to myself. I was exactly the man she'd taken me for. She just never once wondered what a quiet man does after he's been underestimated for 40 years by people who assumed silence meant nothing was happening underneath it. She came home at 8:45 that night. "Something smells wonderful," she said, dropping her bag. "Pot roast," I said. "Sit down." We ate. She talked about her day, the edited version. I talked about mine, also edited. We watched the news, went to bed, and while she slept, I lay there and made a decision that I understood. Even then, would take a couple of years to see all the way through. No confrontation, no scene. Because the only way to answer a plan like that is with a better one. If you've been with me a while, you know I ask this every time. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet. It costs you nothing, and it means a lot to an old man telling stories on the internet. Drop a comment. Let me know what you'd have done in my shoes. People think patience is weakness, passive, something you settle for when you've run out of options. They're wrong. Patience, real patience, is the most aggressive thing a man can choose. It's waking up every morning knowing exactly what's sitting in a folder labeled contingency and choosing to pour her coffee anyway, choosing to ask about her day, choosing not to flinch. That's not surrender. That's a war being fought so quietly the other side doesn't know it started. The following Saturday, I called Everett Landry, my attorney, an old friend from back before I sold the company. Everett has a face like a man who's heard every excuse in creation and stopped being surprised by any of them. "Everett," I said, "I need you to come to Charlotte." "When?" "This week, if you can." "That's serious?" I looked out at our backyard, the dogwoods just starting to bud. No, I said. It's about to get good. He flew in 2 days later. Small office I kept downtown, paid through a management company Denise had never heard of, because as far as she knew, my only office was the kitchen table. Everett sat down, set his coffee on the desk, and said, "Talk." So I did. All of it. Atlanta. The 18 months of dating. The wedding. The folder labeled contingency. Dr. Voss's name on page 6. Everett didn't interrupt once, which for a man who bills by the hour is rare. When I finished, he leaned back and stared at the ceiling a long moment. "She wrote it down," he said quietly. 9 pages, planned out like a merger. "Both," I said, "which is exactly what we're going to use." He picked up his legal pad. "What do you want to do?" I told him. His eyebrows went up slowly, the way they do when a man who's seen everything sees something new. "You've been sitting on this since March," he said. "I've had time to think, Everett." She gave me a 4-phase plan. I intend to use the same runway. He smiled, which I hadn't seen him do in years. "All right," he said. "Let's build something." We started that Monday. First, a holding company, registered quietly in Delaware. We called it Blue Ridge Cordage LLC, a name so plain nobody's eyes would linger on it twice. Boring names hide interesting things. I'd learned that the first time I ever built anything worth protecting. The first move through Blue Ridge was the one that mattered most, a 9% stake in the private equity group that held the management contract for Denise's hospital system. Not the hospital itself. The company that ran the business side of it, the one that decided budgets, contracts, executive compensation, the thing she never once thought to look at, because in her mind, that world belonged entirely to people like her, and I was a man who used to drive a forklift for a living, as far as she knew. I bought in slowly, across 4 separate transactions over 5 months, none of them large enough to trip a disclosure requirement on their own. Invisible, boring on paper. By the time it was finished, I owned a quiet piece of the very system she was counting on to make her its next president. She made me dinner that spring and told me I was the steadiest thing in her life. I told her she kept me on my toes. She had no idea how true that was. Here's the part people get wrong when I tell this story. They assume I went cold, checked out. I didn't. I kept remembering our anniversary. I kept walking the Greenway with her on Sunday mornings. I asked about her budget meetings and actually listened to the answers, because the moment she felt even a degree of change in me, the whole thing would have unraveled. Denise could read people the way some folks read a headline fast, and usually right. So I gave her nothing to read. I smiled. I poured the wine. And every other Saturday morning, I drove downtown and quietly took apart the foundation she thought she'd built her future on top of. But I want to be honest about something, because this isn't only a story about strategy. There were nights more than I'd like to admit where I sat alone at that kitchen table after she'd gone up to bed, and I felt something that wasn't anger, something closer to grief. I had genuinely loved this woman, or I'd loved the version of her I met in that ballroom in Atlanta, which might be the same thing, or might be worse. There was one night in particular, in January, sleet against the windows, the house gone quiet. I sat with a glass of bourbon I never drank, thinking about the fact that I'd walked into that fundraiser 6 years earlier and genuinely believed I'd gotten lucky. Some stubborn part of me had wanted it to be real even after I read that document. I sat with that feeling for a good 10 minutes. Then I poured the bourbon out, rinsed the glass, and went up to bed. The next morning I drove downtown and kept building. Wanting something to be different and letting it break you are 2 very different choices. I chose the second one not to happen to me. By that summer, I moved into the hospital's supply contracts. Denise talked constantly at dinner about vendor troubles, a medical equipment supplier out of Raleigh, falling behind on delivery, a staffing agency in Columbia overbilling the system. I nodded along, sympathetic, refilling her glass, taking mental notes the whole time. Both companies, it turned out, were quietly looking for capital. I became a silent investor in both, not controlling stakes, just enough presence that when her team sat down to renegotiate those contracts, the people across the table answered, several layers removed, to me. She was negotiating against people who worked for her husband and didn't know it. That fall, Everett called on a Thursday. Aaron Voss, he said, no greeting. He's been quietly raising money for a private healthcare consulting fund on the side. Small. A handful of investors. How much to get in? $1.5 million to anchor it. He'd take less from the right partner. Become the right partner, I said. 3 layers, minimum. He cannot know it's me. He calls you chief, Everett said. I want 4 layers, I said. Everett actually laughed. First time in months. By early winter, I was a silent, limited partner in Dr. Aaron Voss's consulting fund. The man on page 6 of my wife's transition plan was, without knowing it, now in business with the husband he'd been quietly circling. By the following January, here's what the board looked like, though only 2 of us knew it. Blue Ridge Cordage held 9% of the management group running her hospital system. 2 of her major vendors carried my capital. Aaron Voss's fund was anchored, 4 layers deep, by me. And Denise was having the best year of her career. The board loved her. She had no idea the ground underneath all of it had a different owner. A year to the week after she'd set that folder on my kitchen counter, Everett called at 9 in the morning. Everything's in position, he said. You want me to start the counter document? Not a counter, I said. A disclosure. How thorough. I want her attorney to sit down when he opens it. 2 weeks later, Everett walked into my office with 31 pages and set them on the desk like they might go off. I read every page slowly. 9 tech and industrial holdings from the original company sale. The Blue Ridge stake in her hospital's management group. Both vendor investments, fully documented. The Voss fund, all 4 layers traced straight back to me. Her agreement had been 14 pages. I came back with more than double that, in a different currency entirely. Send it, I said. The call came from her attorney, Marcus Prelwitz, a man with 20 years in family law who by reputation had seen everything. Everett said the call lasted 5 minutes, and Marcus spoke like a man crossing a frozen lake. Mr. Combs' holdings, he said carefully, are considerably more substantial than what was represented. Yes, Everett said. They are. Your client would like to revisit the terms. Everett looked at me across the desk. I shook my head once. The terms are hers, Everett said. Mr. Combs wouldn't change a word. Marcus was quiet a long moment. I'll be in touch, he said finally. There's a point in any long game where the whole board tilts, quietly, without a sound. That moment came a few days later. Denise came home early on a Wednesday afternoon. She never came home early. Not once in 6 years, and I found her sitting at the kitchen table with no laptop, no blazer, just sitting. You're home early, I said, setting my keys down. She looked at me for a long time, really looked, the way she had that first night in Atlanta. Marcus called, she said. Your attorney? Yes. Blue Ridge Cordage, she said. What about it? You know exactly what about it, Walter. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somebody's sprinkler was running, a dog barking 2 yards over. How long? She said. Her voice was steady. I'll give her that. She didn't crack easy. Since March, a year and a half ago, I said. She closed her eyes for just a second, and I watched the calculation happen behind them. The contingency file, she said. The contingency file, I said. She stood, walked to the window, stood there with her back to me. I let her stand there. I'd stopped being in a hurry a long time before that afternoon. How much do you actually have, Walter? She asked, not turning around. It wasn't really a question. It was the sound of somebody doing math they didn't like the answer to. More than your attorney thought, I said. She turned around, and for a moment I saw something in her face I hadn't expected. Not calculation, not fury, just something stripped bare and tired. What do you want? She said, quieter now. What do you actually want, Walter? I thought about the honest answer, not the legal one. I had wanted a real marriage. I had wanted the woman from that ballroom who laughed before I even finished the joke. But that woman had been a performance from the start, and you can't ask to get back something that was never really there. Nothing you haven't already offered, I said. Your agreement stands, every word of it. It only ever protected what you listed. She stared at me, waiting for the catch that wasn't coming. You built all of that, she said slowly, while we were walking the Greenway on Sundays, while I was making you dinner. You were planning phase 4, I said. I was planning the rest of the board. She shook her head, not in anger exactly, something closer to disbelief. I underestimated you, she said finally. Yes, I said. You did. She nodded once, picked up her bag, and walked out. I heard the front door close behind her. I stood at the window a while, looking at the same quiet street she'd just been looking at. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like something ending the way it probably should have ended from the beginning, if either of us had been honest at the start. The dissolution went through that spring. Her agreement protected exactly what she'd declared: her retirement accounts, her personal savings, her hospital equity. It said nothing about Blue Ridge Cottage, because she'd written it for a man with modest, unverified assets, and that man had never existed. She had no defense against the man she'd actually married, because she'd never bothered to find out who that was. I moved out that week into a house on the lake, smaller, quieter, better light in the mornings. I stood on the dock the first night with a glass of red and felt something I hadn't felt in almost 2 years. Not triumph, just still. The kind of quiet you only notice once a long noise finally stops. That summer, the hospital's management group called an emergency board session. Blue Ridge's stake, now public through the filings, had sent a ripple through the room. The institutional partner who'd sent those absurd orchids to our wedding 6 years earlier requested a formal meeting. I finally understood why. They hadn't been celebrating a marriage. They'd been protecting an investment they didn't yet know I was part of. Dr. Voss resigned from the fund a few months later, citing personal priorities. I never made a single call about it. I didn't have to. By late summer, the board reached out to Everett, almost apologetically, asking whether I'd consider a formal seat, not an advisory role. A seat on the board that decided everything Denise had spent her career trying to run. You know she'll see the announcement, Everett said. I know, I said. And? And nothing, I said, looking out over the lake. It's just business. On a Sunday morning that September, I read about the appointment in the paper over coffee at a diner nobody in that town had any reason to recognize me in. My old friend Carol called around 10. I saw it, she said. I told you 6 years ago somebody needed to see you the way I do. You did, I said. So, how do you feel? I thought about the January night with the bourbon I never drank. The pot roast I made for two while a 9-page plan sat 3 feet away in a laptop I hadn't closed yet. I thought about what I'd wanted and what I'd actually gotten, and how sometimes those two things, even completely different, still add up to something a man can live with. I'm all right, Carol, I said. And I meant it. If this one hit home for you, tell me in the comments. I read every one. Hit subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you next time.